Welcome, everybody. My name is Todd Presner. I'm the faculty chair of UCLA's Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. I'm very happy to welcome you today to our virtual lecture with Professor Hannah Pollin-Galay, who will speak today on the topic of vulgar, poetic, and full of truth Yiddish words of the Holocaust, which is the talk today is part of a forthcoming book, which we're really excited about. I would like to welcome you on the behalf of the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies. We hope that you can join us for many other events this year, and you can find out more information about those events on the Leve Center website. I do want to also thank the Leve Center staff for making the arrangements for today's event, and for the folks out there who are watching and staying virtually connected with us. We want to thank you. Thank you all. So a brief introduction to our speaker. Professor Hannah Pollin-Galay is assistant professor in the Department of Literature at Tel-Aviv University, where she's head of the Jonah Goldrich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. Among her many roles, she directs an international Yiddish summer program and also edits the online journal for Yiddish Hebrew literary translation, Übersetz. Professor Pollin-Galay, her research and teaching is in Holocaust studies and Yiddish literature, and she's recently published on the poetry of Chava Rosenfarb, an epic poem called From the Depths, which is in the journal In Gewebe. Her first book, Ecologies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, came out in 2018 with Yale University Press. And she's currently completing a book, which is about to come out, I believe, on Yiddish of the Holocaust, which is the topic of today's lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pollin-Galay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Presner, and thank you for including me in this series. It's very exciting for me. I'll begin. Nachman Blumenthal, a teacher and cultural activist from the Lublin area, returned to his liberated hometown in the spring of 1944. And this was after he had fled Poland at the outbreak of war and found refuge in an occupied Soviet Union for the duration of the war years. He returned to Lublin and he encountered local Jews, friends, who, unlike him, had survived the war years in the Nazi ghettos and camps. And Blumenthal experienced what he described as lingual shock. He was perplexed. He discovered that a language gap had grown between him and his friends, even though all of them were native speakers of Yiddish. And he wrote about this experience, and he said, much of what these survivors told me I couldn't understand. Ordinary, everyday Jews now used words like Kripo, Obman, Aktie, Leistung, Rollkommande, Kennkarte, Schaber, Schabrevin, Schuches. I leave these terms untranslated, foreign to you, my English listeners now, as they must have sounded foreign to Blumenthal at the time as a speaker of normal Yiddish. Based on this experience of lingual shock, of hearing these words that he couldn't understand in his mother tongue, Blumenthal intuited that the spoken Yiddish word, so rapidly and drastically altered, so full of code words for coded experiences, contained a profound truth about what Jews had endured under German occupation. Blumenthal then set out like a detective to record and gloss every verbal scrap he could find from the Holocaust, terms from ghettos and camps, finding them, interviewing people about them, looking them up from scraps of paper, glossing them, and he published his findings first as a serial dictionary between 1956 and 1964, and subsequently as a book. Blumenthal's urgent lexicographic project may strike some of us as strange. Compiling a dictionary is not considered a typical response to learning about the murder of one's entire family and community. And yet, Blumenthal was hardly alone in his urgent documentation and analysis of Yiddish words from the Holocaust. Yiddish words that I will be referring to collectively as Khurbn Yiddish, that is Yiddish of the Holocaust. In fact, at this exact same post-war moment, an emaciated survivor of the Kovno ghetto and Dachau concentration camp named Yisrael Kaplan also threw himself into the glossing of Khurbn Yiddish words, even before he had fully regained basic physical functions. Like Blumenthal, Kaplan also published a dictionary of such terms, first serially between 1946 and 48, and then in book form, calling his collection, and this is Blumenthal's dictionary when it was published in its first form, and here's Kaplan in his dictionary when it was published in 1949, calling his collection Das Volksmodell für Nazi-Klem, Jewish folk expressions from the Nazi yoke. And that was not all. Across the Soviet border, the Yiddish linguist Elias Spivak authored a parallel work entitled Die Sprache in die Tage von der Vaterländischen Milchome, The Language in the Days of the Great Patriotic War, which came out in Kiev 46. Along with these extensive dictionaries, there are also at least 10 brief glossaries, which appeared in displaced persons publications, as well as appendices to early history books. And even before this burst of post-war Yiddish glossing and lexicographic collecting, Jews in multiple ghettos had already begun documenting the way that Yiddish was changing in real time during the Holocaust. Together, these dictionaries and dictionary-like texts manifest a substantial and perplexing phenomenon that deserves our attention. It was an attempt to witness genocide not only by narrating events, but by listing and defining words. Granted, Yiddishists were certainly not alone in claiming that the Second World War had somehow reshaped the act of speaking. In 1947, the German philologist Victor Klemperer averred that the Nazis had created their own perverse dialect of German, Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich, which he cataloged in a personal memoir cum lexicon by that name. In these same post-war years, the German philosopher Dolf Sternberger worked with two colleagues to produce the Dictionary of Inhumanity, an alphabetized study of German words that were invented or reborn under the Nazis. And those scholars have researched these and other claims with regard to German language or to camp jargon in general. Very little is known about early efforts to understand the Holocaust's impact on Yiddish in particular. And this is strange and something that I believe deserves correction, since East European Jews at the time were fascinated, perplexed, and at times disgusted by the changes in their language in the mid-1940s. Many Yiddish speakers and researchers agreed that they could and should witness the Holocaust through a study of the words it produced. However, we should be careful about essentializing this lexicographic impulse. These lexicographers, professional lay lexicographers, disagreed about what exactly those words had witnessed. Enlisting a psychological, scientific approach, for example, Blumenthal, whom I began my lecture, he presented words as Jews, and I quote, psychomotoric and primitive reactions to shock. That is, he believed that the Jewish mouth could not help but react to the body's torment. By contrast, Yisrael Kaplan saw new Yiddish words as evidence of resilience. Language innovation was, and I quote, a wonderful balm for Jewish suffering. And Elias Spivak considered language in light of Soviet soul engineering. He placed what he called a, quote, rubric of pain words in a dialectical relationship with new Yiddish idioms for revenge and hatred, heroism, terms drawn from Jews fighting on the front. And in Spivak's glossaries, these thesis and antithesis, pain and courage, two vocabularies would eventually unite to form a new synthetic Yiddish of the future. But beyond these lexicographers' own ways of explaining their projects, I think it is important to go back to a phenomenon and ask, why did the historical actors within their cultural moment do what they did? But I think we can also go beyond that and try to ask, what is it in a dictionary that would attract this attention? What would a lexicon, a glossary, or a dictionary offer to victims of violent atrocity? And in part, I think that the answer might be about time-space relationships. That is, a dictionary or glossary can suspend the flow of events. Rather than proceeding on the dizzying timeline of roundups, restrictions, mass shootings, deportations, and selections that are a part of nearly every Holocaust narrative when it's narrated as beginning, middle, and end, a dictionary offers a pause and allows people to explore the relationship between different objects and ideas within that world of prisoners in ghettos and camps. We might think about Umberto Eco's essay on dictionaries and encyclopedias, where he describes the dictionary and all of its generic kin as maps or labyrinths, and what they chart is how knowledge is organized and applied among members of a cultural network at a given moment in time. Dictionaries, and here I quote, "They do not concern purely our linguistic knowledge without giving instructions as to how to use linguistic terms in order to mention things or states of the world." In other words, dictionaries in their ilk are also how-to books, modeling modalities of language and thought rather than merely providing a list of discrete lexical terms. Eco is interested in how language works, and that's helpful. But I think that there is something in these Khurbn Yiddish dictionaries that might imply that their authors, their creators, felt that language did not exactly work during the Holocaust, or did not work for them the way they wanted or expected it to work. And that this glossological obsession, this drive to collect and explain words, might testify to an unfulfilled desire to translate these terms from Khurbn Yiddish into some idea of regular Yiddish, regular speech. And in this sense, the text that I'm going to explore with you today remind me also of Emily Apter's inventory of untranslatables. Her untranslatables are ideas and things that put pressure on speech. The untranslatable can come off as nonsense that becomes accessible through the sheer force of grammar. And these Khurbn Yiddish lexicons invite us into that grammatical force of victim speech in camps and ghettos. So, what were the realms of life that put so much pressure on the Yiddish word during the Holocaust that they required glossing, reglossing, and neologizing, explaining, etymologizing? The lexicons are indeed labyrinthine in nature, and thus one could enter their nexus of wormholes and thematic knots at virtually any point in this labyrinth and come up somewhere else entirely. Today, I will try to enter this labyrinth through two thematic pressure points. First, words for theft, and next, words for the effeminate, sexualized female body. First, theft. The topic of stealing, bribing, and smuggling covers the pages of the Khurbn Yiddish dictionaries. Samin, to poison. Pgire, death as an animal. Matan b'seiser, to give in secret, a revered form of charity in Jewish tradition. Vashevin and Arain vashevin, to haul logs out of water, to haul logs in water. All these words now refer to some variant of stealing, smuggling, or black marketeering in Jewish ghettos and camps. Klepsy was also a word for theft, based on the Yiddishization of the Greek word klefts, meaning brigands, like kleptomaniac. A term with a familiar ring yet a different etymology was comme ci, comme ça from French, which cropped up in the Flossenburg camp in their version of Khurbn Yiddish. If, as Umberto Eco suggests, dictionaries are a map of how knowledge is organized and prioritized in a given cultural network, then theft and smuggling had become the new capital city of Khurbn Yiddish during the war. One of the most important terms in this cluster, an infamous idiom of Holocaust speech in other languages as well, was organisieren, which literally meant to organize. But of course, the literal definition does nothing for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't need this lecture today. So how did organize, a word whose typical meaning is so mundane, so innocuous, come to mean stealing? Let's step beyond the Khurbn Yiddish nexus for a moment to the writings again of the German philologist Victor Klemperer, who was ethnically Jewish. We find in his writings in LTE, we find a potentially interesting starting point for the term organisieren. In his book, The Language of the Third Reich, Klemperer writes that National Socialism replaced the word system, which was frequently used in the Weimar period, with Organisation, organization, which was an organic form of power, supposedly. And in that sense, the Nazis activated the root orgeo, organic, organization, meaning that power was natural and biological in the Nazis' hand. And Klemperer writes, organization had a, quote, magical aura in the Nazi lexicon. However, as Klemperer tells it in the word's biography, organization shifted at some point in the war, roughly around the time of the Battle of Stalingrad, and it, quote, fell into ill repute. It smelt of wheeling and dealing of black marketeering. That's the German side of the term. A different dynamic developed around the term once it moved to the east and entered the Yiddish folksmoil, the folk's mouth. For instance, in an early Yiddish Khurbn lexicon, which was published in 1946 in the DP newspaper Unsere Stimme, Our Voice, Shmuel Weintraub defines the term as follows: Organisatie. In camp language, this means stealing everything that is important for life. In the camp, organisieren was a synonym for activism, courage, respectability, and so forth. Young and old, men and women all took part in organisieren. That is, among East European victims who had little exposure to the term's earlier developments in Nazi vocabulary, Organisatie lost the aura of organic power. It meant quite straightforwardly theft, gneve, in Weintraub's gloss. Yet despite Weintraub's direct equivalence of Organisatie with theft, he also gives this type of activity, organisieren, to organize, to steal, a positive moral evaluation. Stealing, apparently, when it's a means of survival or getting back at the system that oppresses you, is, according to Weintraub, a sign of respectability. And here the Yiddish word is interesting. Leichtigkeit. Leichtigkeit is a word that people use to describe someone who's polite, who's social, who conducts herself with propriety. And this is now a term that he uses to describe organisieren, a type of theft. As one might expect, the term organisieren soon became outdated in Yiddish, in Khurbn Yiddish, that is, tired, uninteresting, or recognizable to an overseer's ears, and thus Jews had to keep inventing new synonyms and neologizing more and more on this topic. The process led to strange and seemingly random turns of phrase, such as shaberin, shabrevin, a word that the etymology of this is very interesting. I'll have to explain the whole story behind this later, but Yiddish speakers among us will mostly find these syllables nonsense, because for most people they were up until the war, which meant to loot or to take ownerless property, which is a very complicated combination. Or as another example, labern die Druske. Labern, before the war, meant to jabber, to chat too much. And druska is from Lithuanian, salt. So if we take this term literally, it means chatting up the salt. Chatting up the salt was another way of saying stealing. Or take the development in the Lodz ghetto, that the writer Josef Zelkovich notes that the word bieglin, apparently taken from a German word denoting ironing, to iron, beagle came to mean stealing wood from a tram car. That term somehow got old in Lodz and was switched out for the phrase chalenemen, which means literally to pull a piece of challah dough while baking as a ritual sacrifice. Challah nemen for stealing, but that also got old. And the lamed, the L sound, was replaced with a nun sound, and chane was the newest word for stealing in the Lodge ghetto. So a typical female name, my name Chane, meant theft, stealing. There could be a utilitarian purpose to this rapid-fire neologizing, simply hiding or protecting one's actions from the oppressive power. There could be an element of pleasure, humor, and inventiveness in this process. But I think that we should not discount the possibility that this hyperactive word replacement on the topic of theft was also a sign of discomfort, shame, embarrassment, and moral confusion. This is precisely what Yosef Zelkovich thought in the Lodge ghetto when he gives us yet another synonym for organisieren and theft, this time drawn from the lowest bodily realm, vaselinieren, to Vaseline. And this was written in the Lodge ghetto. As you recall, I mentioned that the process of of glossing and researching speech happened in real time. People were fascinated by the language that they were hearing and speaking while they were in the ghettos and camps. In the ghetto, this means working someone over with soft, slippery, flattering speech, crawling into someone's heart in order to get something out of them, flattering someone in an ugly, whorish manner, zoinischen Eufen. Clustering together dirty exchanges of money, of words, and of sex, Zelkovich's writing recalls a long-standing parallel between the two dynamic zones of the human body, the mouth and the female organ. In Western aesthetic tradition, as Winfried Menninghaus points out, these two orifices are presented as the most vulnerable to corruption and with the strongest potential to repulse. Garnering this imagery around the definition of vaselinieren, Zelkovich seems bent on repulsing the reader. Repulsion as a form of awakening, witnessing, getting people to notice changes in their moral standards and in their speech. In defining vaselinieren, Zelkovich also makes a comment about Khurbn Yiddish on the whole. He submits a meta-linguistic complaint against the slippery quality of this new sociolect. It contains an overpowering pressure to euphemize, one that moved from Nazi Deutsch, Nazi German, to in fact even internal Yiddish conversations. With the term vaselinieren, we have already run into another thematic hotspot of Khurbn Yiddish. That is the female body. Note that to condemn euphemistic speech, Zelkovich likens that speech to an eroticized womanly body. Recall the zoinischen Eufen in a whorish manner is how people were speaking. And indeed, we cannot get far in Khurbn Yiddish without running into a word or expression that evokes female or effeminate sexuality in some fashion. There was, for instance, the word kuzinke, literally a female cousin, but in the Khurbn Yiddish of one camp meant a woman who bartered sex for privileges and food. Or take the word blondinke, which literally means a female blonde, and in the camps it meant a female louse. And there's a play on words here between, in Yiddish, lois means louse and lois means loose, as in a loose woman. And there was also loiserin, a filthy, starving woman who was sexually unappealing. In this word cluster, there's one important term that I'd like to focus on with you today, and that is people, which some people may have heard of. It's one of the more famous words in Khurbn Yiddish. And in fact, the Yiddish Hebrew writer Katsetnik, and I call him a Yiddish writer before I call him a Hebrew writer. Some listeners may disagree with that. You'll just have to read my work to find out how I can justify that. Katsetnik called one of his novels, Kerulo People. He was called People, and he includes a gloss of the word on the cover. That's how important glossing these words was in this culture, in this survival culture. So what is the word people? People meant a male prostitute who was considered effeminate. in the camps, mostly in Auschwitz. The etymology of the word is complex. It seems likely that it was derived from a rare German regionalism, people, which can mean a small boy or a penis. However, most Yiddish speakers were not aware of that German regionalism, it appears, and they understood the etymology differently. They understood people as a Yiddishized or diminutive term of Puppe, which is doll in German. And you can see in different Yiddish writings, I won't go into depth now, how they connect the word puppe and people, a doll, a female character, and a figure, and people, a male, effeminate character. So the word in their cultural understanding, cultural imagination, the word itself was a lingual hybrid, a cross between German and Yiddish. And it was a gender hybrid. It was someone who was a cross between male and female. About the people itself, there's also a lot of interesting research about, not about the word necessarily, but about this practice. For instance, Jeffrey Wallen has described the phenomenon of the people as follows: the young people was thrust into a position of power, complicity, and sexual abuse, end quote. And as a result, the people was both an object of prisoner pity in the camps, as well as a victim of sexual exploitation and violence, and also an object of envy as someone who could use sexual capital as a means for survival in the camp. The lexicographers, lots of people have something to say about them, this word, and they speak about it in it's difficult. You can tell they're having difficulty approaching this topic. Yisrael Kaplan, who's usually, as I mentioned in the beginning, his mode of glossing is about resilience and humor, and he wants us to see the pleasure and the comedy behind these words, and yet people really trips him up. That is it. This is a word that's not funny for him. His tone changes. This is how he defines the word from Yisrael Kaplan's dictionary. Capos in the Auschwitz Academy also used to pick out individuals, each according to his custom and his style. Most of the time, it was from the younger crowd who had spent their early years without supervision of parents, trained in Auschwitz, and raised there. Some of them became the personal servants of SS men and were exploited by these masters for their basest pleasures. These young children sadly never knew that they had been denied a normal life. On the contrary, they used to be proud of their quote-unquote rank, to be a people, a kind of fella that was very popular in the camps. And a definition. So this contrasts the flowing tongue-in-cheek prose that Kaplan uses to define and connect most of the other terms in his dictionary. Tipel slows him down, it trips him up. The definition is densely filled with ironic quotation marks, you might have noticed. So he's trying to put some ironic gap between himself and the word, but there's also something that draws Kaplan into a more solemn and mournful, earnest tone even than in his other definitions. It's an exception, an interruption. The term punctures Kaplan's witty persona, this the voice of a camp tour guide that he has throughout the rest of his dictionary. And people trips up other writers and lexicographers too. This is Mordechai Striegler, who was a survivor novelist, and he uses a lot of gloss and Khurbn Yiddish words in his writings. He also slows down and finds something that puncturing about this word, people. He calls it pupil. Pupil was also a variant of the word. The pupils were the boot shiners for the camp elders and important prisoners. These elders were just old prisoners who had been cut off from normal life for a long time, and it was therefore self-evident what they used these boys for. And that the ellipses are Striegler's. This is the chapter about which it is most painful for me to write. But this is reality. These young boys had almost unlimited power over the camp, and everyone trembled before them. Striegler's ellipses are a crucial part of his gloss. people interrupts the rhetorical confidence that the young novelist shows elsewhere in his writings. Certainly, the fact that this term relates to child exploitation rather than a borderline consensual love affair between adults, as in other sex terms in Khurbn Yiddish, this could have rendered people more frightening to him than other words in this cluster, like kuzinke that I mentioned earlier. Similarly, the notion that this practice stunted intergenerational links, making aggressive non-Jewish overseers into surrogate parents for Jewish boys, so sexual exploitation is parenting for these boys in the camps, also might have made it exceptionally painful. As an additional reason, I think that the people, the word, and the phenomenon may have evoked particular revulsion and horror for these male commentators because they saw it as a forced feminization of the male body. If the woman's body is a site of cultural, moral, and lingual vulnerability in these other Khurbn Yiddish words, then the people represents the frightening possibility that Nazi oppression could penetrate the male conscience and the male body as it would under normally oppressive circumstances only women. The prominent survivor historian Philip Friedman activates this symbolic possibility when he introduces and defines the term people in his 1950 Yiddish language history book, Oshwenshim, Auschwitz. Friedman glosses the term when discussing Auschwitz functionaries, and he writes that capos were, quote, drunks, degenerates, and homosexuals who forced boys to submit to them, demoralizing them. These boys were called peoples. You probably noticed that Friedman conflates pedophilia with homosexuality, as was very common at the time. He's not alone in doing that. And Friedman uses the word moral to describe an incursion that was both physical and spiritual. So this idea that one could feminize the male body through the violent practice of the people also meant that one could penetrate male morality in a way that was frightening and seemingly different than in other events. Importantly, the word people also helps draw a connection between Khurbn Yiddish lexicography and more widely read works of Holocaust literature. I mentioned Khurbn earlier, but and that's the title of one of his novels. Additionally, as is usually not noted, people appears at the very center of the most significant Holocaust memoir, Elie Wiesel's Night. In the famous hanging scene of this book, that is in arguably one of the most well-known, prominent books of Holocaust literature, and in the scene that is one of the most prominent scenes in one of the most prominent books, right in the center, we find the word people. Though most people haven't noticed that or look past it. The term is included in transliteration. And here I cite the English translation exactly as it appears in print. In his service was a young boy, a people as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the people were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread. Understood?" But the Dutchman's little servant, that is the one that's about to be hanged, was beloved by all. His was the face of an angel in distress. So Wiesel goes on to describe how this angelic-looking boy, the people, remained alive on the noose for quite some time, writhing between life and death, because he's so light, he weighs so little. And that's the sight that causes the onlookers and maybe Eliezer, the narrator, Wiesel himself, to question the existence of God. This is a moment that is often cited. There's an essay about how to teach this moment. It's considered a turning point, raises questions about the possibility of faith in light of the Holocaust, and with so much attention paid to faith in this scene, the mysterious role of the people, the word that is, passes under many readers' radar. And since the international version of the text, which I've just read to you, offers no information about the origin or meaning of this transliterated term, you're just supposed to accept that it's there and keep reading, right? There's no explanation. This is not the case in the Yiddish original. As is well known, Elie Wiesel originally wrote this memoir in Yiddish under a different title, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world kept silent. He wrote that in 1954, published it in 56, and then he adapted it, shortened it, translated it, and changed it profoundly when he moved it into French, La Nuit, which he published in 1958. And scholars like David Roskis and Nomi Seidman have discussed the difference between these versions. And all subsequent versions of Night, like the one I just read in English, stay close to the French. So much gets taken out of the Yiddish world of the original, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world kept silent, when he moves it into La Nuit, into night. Why did he leave this word? And why did he leave it there in such a strange way? He left it there in italics, so we know that it's a foreign word, but he doesn't explain it. There's no gloss. It's stripped of any meaning. And I've taught Night quite a few times in English and sometimes in Hebrew. And I ask my students, I ask the readers, what does the word people mean? You read the book, you understood the book, you're discussing the book. What does it mean? Most don't know, thankfully. They don't know. And they said, we read it, we encountered it as something strange on the page, and we kept going, we looked past it. And I think that that's what Wiesel wants a certain sector of his readers to do, to encounter something strange on the page, to see the trace of a language that was lost, but that was there, that there was another language spoken in the camp. But for those in the know, this transliterated word on the page, people, it works like a dog whistle, inviting them to remember the gritty, truthful language world of Khurbn Yiddish that was largely taken out in the process of adaptation and translation. And beyond this term, beyond terms for the effeminate body, the body in general occupied Yiddish speech in a way that erupted into a newly carnalized Khurbn Yiddish vocabulary. There are words for nutrition. Ee-hee-hee, as in onomatopoeia, like a horse call, meant horse flesh in the Vilna ghetto. There was eschatology. Scheisse, shit in German, was now a term for prisoners, for Jewish prisoners in camps. Fäkalie, a collector of excrement in the Lodz ghetto. And more words related to lice, like Loizen-Allee. A louse alley was a strip shaved down the middle of a prisoner's head for regular lice checks. Lois control were the regular lice checks for camp prisoners, and many more could be cited. I think, however, that even with all of this embodiment in Khurbn Yiddish, ranging from nutrition to lice, to animals, to animality, I think that the words related to the female body carry an added layer of meaning because of their historical residue, because of their connection to earlier cultural, religious, and literary images very much alive in the Jewish textual chain as well as the Western. And I mentioned the Western aesthetic tradition and the way that Winfried Menninghaus highlights the vulnerability of the female organ and the mouth, and how that's used as a metonymy for cultural vulnerability as a whole. But the motif of suffering, the suffering, erotic, and violated female body also appears prominently in the Jewish textual tradition, often as a metonymy, as a symbol for the suffering Jewish people as a whole. So we can recall the book of Eicha, Lamentations, where the book incarnates Jewish shame and anguish through a number of different female figures. So here, for example, What can I take as witness or liken to you, Bat Yerushalayim, O daughter of Jerusalem? All who pass your way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their head at daughter of Jerusalem. So this Bat Yerushalayim, the daughter of Jerusalem, who's been shamed publicly, who gets hissed at and wagged, people wag their heads at her. She was the symbol. This was the symbol of the Jewish moral downfall at that time, the time of Lamentations. And here the echoes, I think, can be heard in Khurbn Yiddish, where these historical habits of looking at and writing about the erotic female make room for reflecting on the Holocaust body. And a familiar, historically tried motif becomes a tool of witnessing something new and alien. Now is a good time to justify the title of my lecture, Vulgar, Poetic, and Full of Truth. I'm guessing that most people listening do not need much convincing at this point that many of the new Yiddish words from camps and ghettos were indeed vulgar. Full of truth also probably makes sense to you. And in fact, the vulgarity and the truthfulness of these words go hand in hand. In the midst of a reality as sickening as the Nazi genocide, it would be a lie to be anything but vulgar, to try to maintain a front of spoken propriety. That would be vulgar, in fact. So those make sense. Vulgar, poetic, vulgar and full of truth. But what about poetic? Why is that in my title? Why have I described words like organisieren, ihihi, loisen alle, people as poetic? Good of you to ask. As many of you may have noticed from the passages I quoted from the novelist Mordechai Striegler and Elie Wiesel, many Yiddish writers during and after the Holocaust felt compelled to record, preserve, and explore the new Yiddish words that they heard and used. In this sense, these writers were not unlike the lexicographers that I've discussed, and that they wanted to explore these words, they wanted to remember them. And yet, when these new words, these neologisms, are incorporated into poetry especially, there is an additional claim being made beyond preservation and explanation. To embed a Khurbn Yiddish word in a poem is to invite us to see a kernel of ingenuity, of beauty in the act of neologizing. To poeticize a Khurbn Yiddish word is to suggest that that term did not only result from Nazi violence towards language, but also from Jewish lingual creativity. It is to reclaim, at least in part, the act of word making. And I'll show you what I mean in a poem by Chava Rosenfarb, a survivor of the Lodz ghetto. And she was part of a poets circle while in the Lodz ghetto, where she experimented with different uses of Khurbn Yiddish words, and this came through in her poetry after the war when she reconstructed some of her poems and wrote new ones. For example, she entitles one poem in her collection, Ghetto und andere Lieder, Ghetto and Other Poems from 1948, Tebetse Ballade, the Ballad of Tebetse. Tebetse was a Khurbn Yiddish word for tuberculosis. The title, Tebetse Ballade, normalizes this neologism, Tebetse, which came from a German acronym and turned into a Yiddish word. It normalizes this neologism by incorporating it into a sing-song rhyme. Tebetse Ballade, it's hard not to hear the music there. And when it's played as music, Tebetse Ballade, this contorted Yiddishized German acronym becomes beautiful for a moment. But then Chava Rosenfarb deflates that musicality of Tebetse with a footnote on the very same page. So I've brought you here in the slide, you can see the title, Tebetse Ballade, asterisk. So that's where the music happens in the title, asterisk footnote, her footnote. And she does this again and again with footnoting, poeticizing and footnoting. And the footnote deflates the musicality. And there the footnote reads, Tebetse, a familiar term in the ghetto. That's how people referred to tuberculosis. Very flat, very harsh. The page thus choreographs a swing between the lyric and the lexicographic, between Khurbn Yiddish as verbal artistry in the music of Tebetse Balade, who could think of that, and Khurbn Yiddish as an artifact of catastrophe. Tebetse is just a term for dying, death, and suffering, nothing more. But neither of these appearances of Tebetse, the poetic in the title or the lexicographic in the footnote, would be fully truthful without the other. And that's why Rosenfarb puts them together in this manner. Another writer who drew out the poetic kernel of Khurbn Yiddish words was Avram Sutzkever, though he did so only in his wartime and early post-war writing. In his 1946 memoir of the Vilna Ghetto, he filled it with neologisms and glosses, and that's in prose. He also, though, made an occasional but very significant use of Khurbn Yiddish in his poetry, as in this poem, Frühling, Spring, which he dated April 1943, meaning he wrote it while in the ghetto, and he published it in Moscow 1944. In Spring, Frühling, Sutzkever, who positions himself as the speaker of this poem, he writes, as I crawl out, he's crawling out of a hiding place, as I crawl out to see the spring with my gelgelatete Lungen, yellow bepatched lungs. Here, so you can hear the neologism, but it's a double neologism. It's not only that Sutzkever allows a true, factual, historically recognized Khurbn Yiddish term, gelelate, yellow star, to appear in his verse. He doesn't just let Khurbn Yiddish in, he also amplifies and extends the neologistic process, taking the neologism one more step further, forging a new adjective out of an already new noun, from gelelate to gelgelatevite. So gelelate is historical, and gelgelatevite is his poetic extension of the poetic process of neologizing that was already extant. So profound, and also we need to look at the metaphor itself, which gives us some instructions on how to read the poetic kernel of Khurbn Yiddish speech. So profound was the impact of this new form of speech in the ghetto that it had already stamped the poet on the inside, on his lungs. Gelgelatevite Lungen, yellow bepatched lungs. The language, the metamorphosis of language is so deep, it has stamped me on the inside, is what I hear him saying. So gelgelatevite Lungen, yellow bepatched lungs, is a result of the wounds the Nazis inflicted on his voice. It's passive, it's a wounding. But when recontextualized in poetry, Sutzkever also uses the word to resist the Nazi strictures to his voice and reclaim his Yiddish speech. So his lungs expand and breathe again once he can say this word in his own inventive manner. Thus, Khurbn Yiddish words were and are, to my mind, not only vulgar and truthful, but also poetic. I want to conclude my talk by addressing a question that might be on many of your minds, which is, where did Khurbn Yiddish go? Outside of the pages of post-war Yiddish literature, that is. Since if there were really thousands of new Yiddish words added to the Yiddish language during the war, and if they were of such great significance to so many Yiddish speakers at the time, why haven't more people heard of them? Why is it most Yiddish speakers alive don't use them, might not even understand them? Did all of the efforts of the Khurbn Yiddish lexicographers come to naught? First of all, I believe that more traces of Khurbn Yiddish remain than we may have recognized, often orally. In oral records, Khurbn Yiddish appears in both the Eichmann trial of 1961, when survivors are testimony, and in survival testimony of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1964. The same is true of witnesses who appear in Claude Lanzmann's seminal film Shoah. They also use Khurbn Yiddish words. And as late as the 1990s, survivors speaking for the Shoah Foundation use Khurbn Yiddish words as key tools of telling their story. And actually, I mentioned that in my first book. The oral longevity of Khurbn Yiddish is also evident in the way that these words continue to haunt other languages that were in contact with Yiddish. To this day, Polish speakers use an uncanny interpretation of the Khurbn Yiddish word shabrevin, shaber. This is an article that happens to be from the early post-war Yiddish words, post-war years, but I understand that the word is still in use in Polish. So Khurbn Yiddish haunts Polish in that sense. Likewise, and this is a hunch, this is the second point is a hunch. It's not something that I can prove, but somebody else can go ahead and prove it or disprove it. Israeli Hebrew also seems to echo Khurbn Yiddish words at times, as in the way that it uses the word le'argen, to organize, in the way that it was used in Khurbn Yiddish, organisieren. When we recall that organisieren was to wheel and deal and get what you need in an underhanded way. When Israeli contemporary Hebrew, people speak of organizing drugs for a party, le'argen samim. That, I believe, also has the echo of Khurbn Yiddish words. And in this sense, both Polish and contemporary Hebrew slang seem to bear traces of Khurbn Yiddish, a sign perhaps that these words were spoken and heard to significant degree in conversations after the war and left their trace more on the languages that remained dominant, more dominant than Yiddish later. When it comes to print, however, it is clear that the most robust and lasting legacy of Khurbn Yiddish remains in the realm of literature, and the realms that I've brought up through some of the poets and novelists we've discussed, as well as in Yizker Bicher. That is, in these places where individual authors had editorial freedom, they could choose to maintain the practice of witnessing through Khurbn Yiddish words, witnessing through lexicography, bringing out this language that was a part of the event. By contrast, Khurbn Yiddish words were largely excluded from newspapers and journalisms, with only a few exceptions. And to a large extent, this decision to exclude Khurbn Yiddish and to marginalize the memory of Khurbn Yiddish was a result of cultural and political shame. If after the Holocaust, proper or literary Yiddish itself was associated with victimization and collective weakness, Khurbn Yiddish aroused even more embarrassment. This wartime sociolite Khurbn Yiddish was seen in its essence as the Yiddish of Yiddish, embarrassing even among their own community. Moreover, as a simple point that we have to remember with most aspects of Holocaust experience, the majority of people who knew and spoke Khurbn Yiddish were murdered in the camps, ghettos, and shooting fields. Their voices don't remain, but their words do. This is the primary reason why the words are not well known today. The speakers were killed. And so when we study Khurbn Yiddish, we are accessing some of the most potent traces that we have of the way that ghetto and camp prisoners spoke at the time of their victimization, of their torment. And this is a strain of language that shows both deep torment as well as creative tenacity. It's this duality, perhaps, that led people like Blumenthal, Kaplan, and Spivak to dedicate themselves to documenting these words, even if doing so went against the cultural tides at the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. What an amazingly rich and generative presentation, Hannah. This is there's really so much to talk about, and really appreciate you taking the time to outline the range of what Khurbn Yiddish meant, and also why it's necessary for us to confront and study it in the wake of the memory and translations of testimony from the Holocaust. I have a couple questions, and I understand, of course, this is part of a greater project, and so if there's intersections with some of the other work that you expect to publish, please feel free to bring that in. But I was thinking about some of your earlier work in ecologies of witnessing, and also some of the work that you published immediately before that, where you focus on Yiddish testimony in terms of both semantic aspects, story, and sound, orality. And in that early work, you really asked, what did Yiddish, what did it sound like? And I'm wondering if there's both a semantic and a phonetic change with regard to Khurbn Yiddish. Are there aspects of sound, orality, accent, dialect, percussiveness? Certainly you indicate that with Sutskever in the emphasis on breath and the woundedness of the speech, and Blumenthal as well, I guess, with regard to the torment in the mouth. I wonder if there's an aspect of thinking about these sort of semantic networks also with regard to how they had a phonetic change as well. So I wonder if you can speak to some of that.
Yes, I mean, I think so. And in fact, there is a testimony that so many thousands that I was lucky enough to read for this book that I can't remember which testimony it is, but there is one testimony that I encountered where someone says that someone's Yiddish, it was Yiddish spoken with the cadence of Nazi German. So there are testimonies about sound and the sound of speech, the way that speech sounded at the time, and I'm sure that there were also phonetic changes. But in some ways, I think about these words almost like that Hasidic story that, oh, once there was, this very long story, about a bird and a tree, and then the tree and the bird were lost, and this was lost, and all that we remember is that there was a story, and there's this one trace, and people have to go back and try to piece together all that happened around that story just through the memory of one single piece of it. I think that's the best way to look at these words. That is, I think that they are markers of a very profound change in language that's much bigger than the specific words themselves. The specific words themselves were a focal point at the time. This was a way that people thought about language at this mid-century moment through lists of words. But I think that the change was much greater, and that, like I said, most of it's lost. We didn't have, a tape recorder in Lodz ghetto. So but we do have these words, and there's a lot that we can pull together and extrapolate from these words and about people's feelings towards words from what does remain.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. I imagine, thinking of like David Boder's 1946 recordings, which are maybe the closest we have, a voice to the event. There, and many of those are multilingual. Of course, they're in Yiddish, they're in German, they're in Russian, many languages. I imagine there may be these traces of these phonetic elements of expressivity that are connected with the kind of semantic changes that you're looking at.
Yes, definitely. And some people say, well, why, you should have a whole nother chapter on orality or look, this is it's a big, rich phenomenon, and I feel like I'm lucky to start this out, and I do literature and do the lexicons and trace the personal journeys of the lexicographers towards this language, what it meant to them, and what language traces meant it at the time. But definitely not the end of the study. So someone who wants to pick this up and do a systematic study in Boder and in the trials and in other places, there's way more room for exploration.
Absolutely. Well, I think you're opening a field up is what you're doing here with this work. And so I think there's a potential for so many scholars to build on the approach that you've had. And really, I think there's so much, as you indicate, there's so much more to be done, so much more to be listened to, right? And read. I wonder if we can, I'm sure people are really interested in your thoughts around Elie Wiesel and the translation process, which was really a transformation process. And I know, of course, Naomi Seidman and David Roskies and others, as you mentioned, have talked about really, I guess to put it in your words, it's a kind of an erasure of certain sense of Khurbn Yiddish in the translation. Although these traces, as you indicate, obviously with people as a particular moment, this foreign, untranslatable term that appears, but then is never glossed, explained. But there's much more, right? There's much more that's in the Yiddish that's left out. Of course, Seidman focuses on the rage, the elements of anger, revenge, nikome, the sense of, of taking, of sexual revenge as well. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to what it means to have taken out most of the rage that Khurbn Yiddish represented in 1954 in its French translation and then English translation, but to leave these traces, right? To leave these little markers. So it's not completely gone. It's not completely erased, but it's a very different experience, as you indicate. So I wonder if you can talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you said it so beautifully. I'm really happy to, hear that interpretation or response or that understanding. I think that's what it is. I think that, I've taught night in English and in Hebrew to people who've never studied the Holocaust before. Sometimes I teach in the English department here, and a lot of and there often like, for example, there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who study in the English department, and this is their first time reading a work of Holocaust literature. And am I really happy that the short, accessible version of Night exists? Yes, it does. It does a lot, and I'm so happy that it's there. And I think that Wiesel did something really profound in reaching that compact, accessible text. To get there, like in so many things, if we want, we want a goal, we want to climb a difficult mountain, we have to give up on a lot, we have to shed a lot of baggage. And I think that today it's a different moment, and in different contexts, we can go back and pick up that baggage and see what's in there. And then also note that he left us almost instructions or invitations to go back and find that baggage.
That's right.
Like the example of people.
Right. It seems to me that it is a transformation, but it's also an opportunity to return. And maybe there's a generational shift or a certain amount of geographic and temporal distance that we have, obviously, with regard to Holocaust education, with regard to understanding the importance of testimony, and that when we go back to it, we go back with a different lens, right? We go back with the perspective that we have today, which would be very different than in reading it in 1954, given the amount of knowledge and the amount of just the fundamental changes in the way we approach Holocaust education and Holocaust knowledge. So it's a really interesting moment to return, in some ways, to Khurbn Yiddish at this moment.
Yes, and I can, when I've spoken on this research, there's a generational divide. Like, I mean, this is second generation, as the children of Holocaust survivors have, I'm not going to stereotype, but this has happened. They've been very offended by my research. No, my parents never spoke that way. They would never, this year really, but I say to them, but this is there, what it's there. And they take offense because they still want to protect the honor of their parents. And I say, I don't think that we need to protect them. I think that their humanity and the enormity of their suffering is there in these words, and also the resilience and the creativity. It's all there. And people who do remember these words, I actually had a chance to write a really short popular article in Hebrew in the newspaper Ynet. And this word shabgavin, I got emails about it from survivors and people, no, that's not the right gloss, and it's still, these words still matter to people who can remember them. So it's a difficult topic, I think, to bring up because it raises questions. It makes, just like it makes the survivors less prophets and more people. But I think that that's a legitimate thing to do at this moment when it's done, of course, in the right spirit, as I hope I'm doing it.
Well, I think your triangulation of vulgar, truth, and poetic is one way to do that, right? We recognize that these words have that vulgarity, they discomfort, that they're disruptive in terms of sexual mores, in terms of maybe, as you said, the image that we may have about what life was like or what people did. The vulgarity is there, but it's also the truth because it's a historical evidence that you're pointing towards. And I think the poetic is really, the why your triangulation to me works really well is precisely because of that expressivity, the possibility, the openness, the formations, right, that come about. And, I'm thinking, I teach Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, as I'm sure you do. And I'm remembering, as you spoke, those elements in which Khurbn Yiddish comes up really quite often in survivor testimonies, and it's peppered throughout. And one of the big challenges is, how do you translate it? And of course, the film is all about translation. And so occasionally a term like Figuren, the German term for the dolls, is talked about as schmattes, and is talked about in French as chiffon, like rags. The Puppen, the Scheissdreck is another term that's used.
Right.
And it's like this whole linguistic moment. But it's, you know, as you said, the evidence is there. It's in the testimonies. And it's an element also of, you know, truth telling. And I think there's a kind of struggle too among the survivors. And this is in the, of course, 1980s probably. I mean, they were filmed over a number of years, but to try to find those words, and then how do you translate them, right? How do you make sense of them? And that's what's so interesting about this moment, is like they become somewhat untranslatable, but they're within a semantic network of many other terms.
Right. I mean, the debates about words in the Warsaw Ghetto, even, that, you know, this word Schabruvin, there are literally recorded debates about what it means, what its etymology is. And this I call it obsessive is maybe not the right word, but there's a compulsive draw towards glossing, explaining, because no explanation is satisfactory. These words, they untranslatable or simply no translation is quite enough. And in that sense, because there's so much truth embedded in them, because they tell a story about geographic movement, they tell a story about different social classes mixing in a new way in these different spaces, they tell a story about emotions that haven't been felt before, about different modalities of your body, of loss of senses, also, like you know, Katsetnik writes about how a Muslim didn't process sound in the same way. And also Israel Kaplan's diary itself actually sort of shows this. Like when he writes, he uses Khurbn Yiddish words, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the way that he's writing, his handwriting, it's off. All of this all together, to put all of this onto the words, it's too much. It's a lot. It's too much. And so they just keep glossing and glossing and glossing. In a sense, you know, it's a bottomless pit. And I think that the best thing to do is, in a sense, to see these dictionaries as a process, you know, that we can visit. We can join this process of searching for a while. And we're not going to get to the bottom of the words, you know, that's not the point, but we can join this process in a way, and we can join this memory, and that might mean something.
Absolutely. It means so much. And I think, you know, your work is a testament to that meaning-making process. Well, I know that we're about up on time, and I want to thank you so much, Hannah, for this extremely rich and generative talk. And we appreciate you taking the time to share it with us, and really look forward to seeing the book. It's really fantastic.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for the wonderful questions.
Sure.